The old manor. There was always one story that the villagers would whisper about when the sun went down. The story of the old manor at the edge of town. It had stood there for as long as anyone could remember, crumbling and abandoned, its windows broken, its once grand doors rotting away with time. The story went like this. Long ago, a wealthy family had lived there, but one night, something happened. The family vanished without a trace, and no one ever saw them again, but the house remained. Some said they could hear faint whispers when walking near the manor at night, as if the family's voices were trapped inside, begging for help. Others claimed to have seen strange figures in the windows, or the lights flickering as if someone was still living inside. "Why do you believe it?" I asked my grandmother once after hearing this tale for the 100th time. "How do you know it's true?" She looked at me with a strange, almost sorrowful expression. "You'll understand when you're older," she said cryptically. "But remember, some stories aren't just stories. Some stories are warnings." The dare. It was the perfect storm of boredom and curiosity that led me to the manor. My friends and I had always scoffed at the rumors, dismissing them as old tales designed to scare children. But this time, we were going to prove that there was nothing to be afraid of. The evening was quiet as we approached the manor, our flashlights flickering in the thickening fog. The house stood tall and foreboding in front of us, its walls covered in ivy, the roof sagging under the weight of years of neglect. "Think there's anything in there?" Mark asked, his voice betraying a mixture of fear and excitement. I shrugged. "It's just an old house. There's no way anything strange is going on. People love telling these stories." But as we stepped closer, something in the air felt wrong. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees, and there was a strange heaviness in the atmosphere, as if the house was watching us. I felt my heart race as we pushed open the creaky door, stepping into the darkness. The unseen. Inside, the house was a maze of darkened hallways. Each one more oppressive than the last. The floorboards creaked under our feet, and every corner seemed to hide a secret. As we made our way through the dimly lit rooms, we found old furniture, dust-covered portraits, and shattered glass. It was like stepping back in time, but something felt off. And then we heard it. A soft whisper. It seemed to come from the walls, echoing through the house like a faint murmur. I froze. Mark turned to me, his eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, my throat suddenly dry. It wasn't just the wind. It wasn't just the house settling. The whispering seemed to follow us, shifting from one corner to the next, growing louder and more frantic. "Let's go," I said, panic creeping into my voice. But before we could turn back, the door slammed shut behind us. The truth. We were trapped. The house felt alive now, as if the walls were closing in. The whispers turned to pleading voices, and the temperature continued to plummet. Our flashlights flickered and died, leaving us in total darkness. The walls seemed to pulse with a strange energy, and then, out of nowhere, we saw them. Figures. Shadowy, indistinct shapes moving just beyond the edge of our vision. They were watching us. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely a breath. There was no answer. The figures didn't approach us, but they didn't leave either. They just stayed, surrounding us in the darkness. And in that moment, I realized that maybe this story was more than just a tale. Maybe those who had disappeared in the house had never really left. Maybe they were still here, trapped between the realms of the living and the dead. "Why are you here?" Mark asked, his voice shaking. One of the figures stepped forward, and for a moment, I thought I saw a face. A pale, hollow face staring back at me with empty eyes. The figure opened its mouth, and I thought I heard the words, "Get out." The escape. We didn't stay to hear more. With all the strength we had left, we bolted for the door. as we ran through the house, it felt like the very walls were fighting against us, like the manor itself was trying to keep us inside. We pushed and shoved, finally bursting through the door just as the whispers reached a crescendo behind us. We stumbled outside, gasping for air, the fog thicker than before. But as we looked back at the manor, we saw it, the faintest silhouette in the upper window, a figure, watching, aftermath. The next morning, we returned to the village. I tried to tell my grandmother what had happened, but when I looked into her eyes, I saw that she already knew. Some stories, she had said, are warnings. Some stories are true. The return. After that night, none of us spoke much about what happened at the manor. We didn't have the courage to revisit it, and the village seemed even quieter than usual. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure in the window, those empty, haunting eyes that seemed to follow me. Days passed, and I began to wonder if it had all been a figment of my imagination. But then, one afternoon, something happened that pulled me back into the darkness. Mark showed up at my house, his face pale and his hands trembling. I think we made a mistake, he said, barely able to meet my gaze. What do you mean? I asked, my heart pounding. He hesitated. I went back. I froze. What? Why would you do that? I needed to know. We never finished it. The story isn't over. The invitation Mark's obsession with the manor only grew after our escape. He kept going back, returning to the house at night when the rest of us refused. Each time he would come back more distant, more withdrawn, as if the house was drawing something out of him. I saw something, he whispered one day. Something different. Different how? I asked, though I already had an idea. A figure, not like the others. It was standing in the center of the grand hall, looking directly at me. And this time, it spoke. I could feel my pulse quicken. What did it say? Mark looked down at the ground, his face etched with fear. It said, "You shouldn't have left." The decision. After hearing this, I knew that I couldn't ignore the truth anymore. There was something in that manner, something that wasn't just part of a scary story. It was real, and if we didn't face it, it would haunt us forever. One evening, after several days of brooding over what had happened, I made a decision. I would return to the manor, not just for myself, but for all of us. I gathered Mark, along with the others who had been with us that fateful night. We needed to go back together. We needed to face the truth. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we set out once more for the manor. This time, however, I didn't feel the excitement of proving a story wrong. I felt dread in my chest, a heavy weight I couldn't shake off. The forgotten room. We entered the manor once again, the door creaking as we pushed it open. The air was thick with decay, and the smell of rot filled our nostrils. The house seemed even darker than before, the shadows stretching across the floor like long, twisted fingers. Every creak and groan of the house sent chills down my spine, but we pressed on, determined to uncover the truth. We made our way to the grand hall, where Mark had seen the figure. The space was vast, with a high ceiling and walls lined with dusty portraits. In the center, where Mark had described the figure standing, there was nothing. But something was different. The room felt alive. "Do you feel that?" Lucy, one of the others, whispered. "It's like the air is moving." We stood frozen, our eyes scanning the room, waiting for something, anything to happen. And then we heard it, the faintest whisper, so soft it could have been the wind. But it wasn't. It was a voice. "Help me." I whipped around, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice had come from a door we had never noticed before. An old wooden door, partially hidden behind a large, decaying tapestry. "That wasn't there before," Mark said, his voice shaking. The door seemed to beckon us, a pull we couldn't ignore. Despite the fear gnawing at me, I found myself walking towards it, my feet moving against my will. The others followed silently, their expressions as pale as mine. We pushed open the door, revealing a narrow staircase that led downward into total darkness. The basement. We hesitated at the top of the stairs, but the pull to go deeper was overwhelming. One by one, we descended, the sound of our footsteps echoing in the empty space. The temperature dropped with each step until we reached the bottom, where a single dim light bulb hung from the ceiling, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The basement was a small, cramped room filled with old furniture and boxes covered in layers of dust, but in the far corner there was something different, a large, rusted iron door. "Is that a prison cell?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Mark didn't answer, but his eyes told me everything. We were getting closer to the heart of the mystery. Without a word, we approached the door. It was locked, but there was an old brass key hanging on the wall beside it. My hand trembled as I reached for the key and unlocked the door. Inside, the air was thick with a stench I can't describe. And then, we saw it. A figure, gaunt and pale, its skin stretched tight over its bones, its eyes wide with terror. It looked up at us, its mouth moving, but no sound came out. I backed away, horrified, but Mark stepped forward. "What is this?" he whispered. The figure's eyes locked onto his, and its lips moved again, forming words, though they were almost impossible to hear. But then they echoed in my mind. "You should have never come back." The final truth. As the figure's voice echoed, the room seemed to warp around us. The walls closed in, the shadows growing darker, deeper. It felt as though the very fabric of reality was unraveling. And then, I understood. The family hadn't vanished. They hadn't just disappeared. They had been trapped, caught between the living and the dead, forever bound to the manor. Their spirits, their souls, had been condemned to remain in that house for all eternity, and now we had become part of their story. Mark reached out to the figure, but it recoiled, fading into the darkness, leaving behind only an empty, hollow space. We ran, not looking back, but the whispers followed us, growing louder with each step. Aftermath. The next morning, we returned to the village, but no one spoke of what we had seen. The manor was still there, standing as silent as ever. The old stories, the whispers, and the warnings, they were all true. And now, we understood. Some stories are meant to be left untold. Some stories are too dangerous to uncover. The mark. We never spoke of what happened in the manor after that night. But the silence didn't bring peace. Each of us had changed in some subtle way, a quiet dread settling deep inside us. The whispers still echoed in my mind, lingering like an unseen presence. It was as though we had all been marked, touched by something far older and far darker than we could ever comprehend. For the next few weeks, I tried to ignore the growing sense of unease that clung to me. But then one night, I woke up to find something on my wrist. A mark. Faint, almost like a bruise, but shaped like a strange symbol. A twisted knot, or maybe a loop. Something that seemed to shift the longer I stared at it. I wasn't the only one. Mark had the same mark on his hand. Lucy had it on her ankle. Each of us, in a different spot, with the same strange symbol. None of us spoke of it, but we all knew. We had returned to the manor, and now it had claimed us. It was waiting for something, for us to finish what we had started. The forgotten path. A week later, the whispers returned. At first, it was just a soft murmur in the background, like a breeze brushing past my ears. But over the days, they grew clearer, more insistent. "Come back," they whispered. "Come back and see." I couldn't ignore it anymore. I didn't want to go, but the pull was undeniable. Something inside me, some dark part of my soul, was drawn to the manor once more. Mark, as restless as I was, called us all together again. "We need to go back. It won't leave us alone until we do." No one argued. That night, we found ourselves standing before the manor once again. The air felt different this time, heavier, as though the house itself was waiting for us. The windows, though long shattered, seemed to watch us with a strange, unblinking gaze. There was no sound, not even the wind. We entered without a word, the door creaking open as though it had been expecting us. Inside, the air was thick with dust, the atmosphere heavy with a sense of foreboding. It felt colder than before, and the darkness pressed in from all sides, swallowing us whole. We walked down the familiar hallways, but this time, the house felt even more alive. The walls seemed to shift, bending and creaking as though they were breathing. And then, just as we reached the grand hall, a strange glow appeared, faint, barely perceptible at first, but growing brighter with each passing second. And then we saw it. A doorway. A new door, one we had never seen before. It was just barely visible in the far corner of the room, tucked behind the shadows. "I've never seen that door," Lucy whispered, her voice trembling. "Has it always been here?" No one had an answer, but the door seemed to beckon us, as though it knew we were coming. And before any of us could stop ourselves, we moved toward it. The descent. The door opened slowly, creaking loudly as though resisting us. Beyond it lay a narrow staircase, spiraling downward into the black void. The temperature dropped instantly, and the whispers grew louder. They were no longer faint. Now, they were words. "Come, closer." "Finish it. Release us." We hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward, descending into the depths. The staircase seemed endless, spiraling down and down into the dark, the walls closing in around us as the air grew colder still. The whispers became a chant, rhythmic and urgent. "Release us. Free us. End this." Finally, we reached the bottom, and there it was. A massive chamber, illuminated by an eerie, pale light that seemed to come from nowhere. The walls were lined with strange symbols, etched deeply into the stone. At the far end of the room stood an altar, its surface slick with a dark, viscous substance. And around the altar, kneeling in twisted positions, were figures, more of them. Their bodies decayed and skeletal, but their eyes were still open, staring at us. These are the family," Mark whispered, stepping forward. But as soon as he spoke, something changed. The figure's eyes snapped open, and they moved. Not all at once, but one by one, slowly and deliberately. The room began to vibrate, the symbols on the walls glowing brighter. As if they were feeding on the energy we brought with us. The whispers turned into a scream. "No! Leave now!" But it was too late. The price. The ground beneath our feet trembled. The altar began to rise, and the figures surrounding it started to chant in unison. Their voices were a chorus of agony, pleading with us, begging us to understand. A dark figure appeared at the center of the room, towering over the altar. It was a shadow, its form indistinct, but its presence overwhelming. It spoke with a voice that seemed to echo inside my skull. "You should not have come back." We couldn't move. The air grew thick, suffocating. It was as though the very atmosphere of the room was alive, pressing against us, trapping us in place. The shadow advanced slowly, its voice growing. The shadow advanced slowly, its voice growing louder, more forceful. "The manor is mine, and so are you." It reached out, and in that instant I felt a cold hand grip my heart. The others began to scream, but their cries were swallowed by the darkness, and then the ground cracked open beneath us, and we fell. The truth unveiled. When we awoke, we were no longer in the manor. The room was gone, replaced by an endless empty void. The whispering had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. But we weren't free. The mark on our bodies had changed. It had grown, spread, as though it had merged with our skin, now an indelible part of us. We could feel the presence of the manor within us, a heavy weight in the back of our minds. The shadow had warned us, but we hadn't understood until it was too late. The manor wasn't just a house. It was a prison, a trap designed to ensnare souls, to hold them in place for eternity. The family that had vanished had been its first victims, but we were its next. We were never meant to leave.